You are watching programming from the East-West Center in Washington, D.C.
We welcome you all to the East-West Center in Washington's virtual seminar on the Pacific Islands and the developmental and economic challenges it faces, based on a new report by the Asian Development Bank. And we are delighted and honored today to have with us Mr. Saeed, Ahmed Saeed from the Asian Development Bank. And my name is Satu Limaye, and I'm the Vice President of the East-West Center, and welcome you to this virtual discussion. Mr. Saeed, our speaker this afternoon, is Vice President of the Asian Development Bank, and he joined that bank 2019 after a long and distinguished career at the U.S. Department of the Treasury, where he was Deputy Assistant Secretary, also Senior Advisor to the Secretary of the Treasury. He also has private sector experience at Morgan Chase in Dubai. He's a graduate of the University of Chicago, both in business school and in law. So he has a legal and finance background that he brings to his current position. We're delighted to have him. And of course, we are always delighted to partner with the Asian Development Bank on the many programs and interactions that we have together. For those of you who know, the East-West Center has a long and storied tradition of working on the Pacific Islands. We have a number of educational exchange and research programs, including our Pacific Island Development Program, which is based in our Honolulu office. And in that context, we'd like to invite Mr. Saeed to kick us off on this very important topic of the economic and developmental challenges in the post-COVID context for the Pacific Islands. And then we will turn to Q&A. The protocols were put up on the website earlier, just so that everyone knows we are on the record today. This program is being recorded on Zoom and also live streamed via YouTube. And at the culmination of Mr. Saeed's remarks, I would ask you to use the chat function and the Q&A functions to pose your comments or questions, and we'll take as many as we can. With that, again, thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Mr. Saeed, who is keeping Manila hours in Durham, North Carolina. Welcome to you, Mr. Saeed.
Thank you, Satu. Yeah, as I mentioned to you, I think I'm the only one doing the reverse commute. But those are the those are the privileges of modern technology. Let me begin just by saying thank you. I'm grateful to you and your team and the East-West Center for giving the ADB the opportunity today to talk about this incredibly important part of the world. We're also grateful, of course, for the tremendous partnership that we've had with the East-West Center for many years. Congratulations also on your 60th anniversary this year. It's something that we certainly hope that we'll be able to celebrate with you and your colleagues in person at some point.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
Well, let me just open up, as you said. I'll make some remarks, and then hopefully we'll have some time for Q&A. If at any point there's any issue with the sound or otherwise, just give me a heads up, and we'll see if we can try to make things better. I think at the outset, just as an overarching comment, one thing I would say is that it's one of the great ironies of this crisis, of this COVID-19 pandemic, that the Pacific, the part of the world that I have to say really seems to have been the most vigilant, and the part of the world that has been least directly impacted by the disease, at least in terms of disease incidence, yet it remains a part of the world that is amongst the most vulnerable. And I think that's one of the great ironies and tragedies of this crisis as it relates to the Pacific, and I'll talk a bit more of that as we go on. I thought I'd begin just by talking about the health impact and about the socioeconomic impact of the crisis, then move on to what we're seeing in terms of a response from countries, how the Asian Development Bank is working with governments to assist, and then perhaps in closing, before we turn to Q&A, we can talk a bit about how we can best support recovery and what we need to do to prepare for a future world that we know must be much, much more resilient. So maybe we just start with economic performance. COVID-19, as I think we'll all recognize, is perhaps the most significant economic shock experienced by the region, certainly in our living memory. Economic and social impacts will significantly overshadow those of the global financial crisis and even those of the severest cyclones and natural disasters. How is this impact propagating? Well, it's propagating obviously in the first instance through health, which, as I noted, is a bit less in the Pacific due to the vigilance of many of the countries. But as an economic matter, we're seeing it come through the tourism channel, through remittances and trade. And the simple reality is that no nation is left untouched. Now, if we look at ADB's Pacific Developing Member countries, by and large, they've avoided the direct health impacts of COVID-19. Many countries took decisive and proactive measures to introduce travel restrictions, some from as early as January, and declare emergencies. The Pacific is home to the most countries that have not reported COVID-19 cases to date. The Cook Islands, Kiribati, RMI, FSM, Nauru, Niue, Palau, Samoa, Solomon Islands, Tonga, Tuvalu, and Vanuatu. That's a long list of places that haven't seen a single case yet. Fiji has identified 18 cases, but reacted very, very proactively. And it's now eliminated local transmission and declared itself COVID-free on June 5. PNG had 8 confirmed cases. Everybody there is recovered. But as I noted at the outset, having avoided the health consequences, at least for now, unfortunately does not mean that the region is immune to other impacts of the disease. And if we just focus on health alone, one thing that's very clear is that while we've been lucky so far, and credit should be appropriately given to governments who realized that they were fragile and vulnerable and moved proactively, if COVID does spread across the region, its results could be catastrophic. And there's a number of reasons for this. First of all, the ability of national health systems to cope is woefully inadequate. In many cases, they lack even normal standards. They simply weren't built for an onslaught of this scale. We've seen elsewhere in the world that comorbidity factors, obesity, diabetes, lung disease, these can have a significant impact. And the incidence of these comorbidity factors is high in many places in the Pacific. Testing capacity is low. Test kits are in limited supply. Many smaller countries depend on Australia and New Zealand for testing, which also means there's significant delay in getting tests processed. PPE, personal protective equipment, and ventilators are in short supply. Hospitals, ICUs, quarantine facilities, all under-equipped, inadequate, and could easily be overwhelmed in case of a COVID-19 outbreak. There are estimates that about 1.2 million people in the Pacific could require hospitalization in the event there's an outbreak, given the poor population health status. We see this, for example, even in relatively affluent places like the Cook Islands, which has one of the highest per capita incomes in the Pacific, and yet estimates indicate that they would need to increase hospital beds 12-fold to deal with local transmission of COVID. In the case of PNG, the health system would need 900 times as many beds as it has now. So these numbers are really stark, and I think underline the degree to which the health issue alone, which up until now has not been so prominent in the Pacific, that issue alone just presents an absolutely enormous risk of incalculable harm. But if we turn next to the socioeconomic impact, we can see that that's already being seen, and that's already beginning to strain economies across the region. In the last few months, economic links with the global economy have already severely eroded. We've seen tourism collapse. Who knows when 2019 tourism numbers will come back? International trade has been disrupted, and remittance flows have also declined. The ADB is projecting a contraction for the Pacific in 2020, perhaps in excess of 4% of GDP. Now, as we know, many countries in the Pacific rely on tourism as a primary driver of their economy. And unfortunately, this crisis, as we all recognize, has had an enormous impact on human mobility and on human travel, and certainly on leisure travel and elective travel. And so tourism-based economies are particularly hard hit. Tourism, as you will know, is a key source of employment and foreign exchange in the Cook Islands, in Fiji, Palau, Samoa, Tonga, and Vanuatu. And these places, many of them, could see double-digit contractions in 2020. With tourists unable or unwilling to travel, resorts are being closed, staff are being laid off, and then this is obviously affecting other elements of the economy that depend on the tourist sector. Handicrafts, small businesses, even imports that relate to tourism sectors, so wine, steaks, travel operators, all of these elements of the economy are being very, very badly impacted. as a consequence of this incredibly sharp slowdown in global travel. It's hard to imagine that these numbers will come back for some time. I'm quite confident that they will come back. In fact, they will one day exceed where they were in 2019. And so I personally think that tourism will remain a key element of economic growth and a driver, but there will be a reasonably large interregnum before we return to the status quo ante. Now, if we turn to a very different kind of economy across the Pacific, the commodity exporters, we find they're also deeply impacted because of a steep fall in global commodity prices. Yet another category of countries is affected by declining construction activity. Smaller islands and atolls like Kiribati, RMI, Micronesia, Nauru, and Tuvalu, all are affected by a decline in construction activity. Equipment and personnel cannot enter borders. This includes development partner supported projects. We're certainly seeing this impact on projects the ADB is involved with around the Pacific. Even fisheries are affected due to travel and social distancing restrictions. Now, aside from tourism and obviously commodity prices, another linkage between the region's economies and those of the world is remittances. Remittances account for a very, very large portion of GDP across the Pacific, averaging almost 10% if we exclude PNG across the region. And remittances are certain to fall due to shrinking global employment and repatriation of seasonal workers. This decline disproportionately affects the most vulnerable. And so, it's really important, I think, not to stay at the level of aggregate GDP data and really focus in on human impact. Unfortunately, we see this all around the world, certainly all across the ADB's regions. Not only are the top line numbers very, very large, but actually once one starts to drill down and look at the human impact, it is unfortunately skewed towards greater impact on the most vulnerable and the poorest. Samoa and Tonga, coming back to this issue of remittances, so important for this segment of society. Samoa and Tonga are, for example, some of the most remittance-dependent economies in the world. In the case of Samoa, remittances are 25% of its GDP. In the case of Tonga, it's 40% of its GDP. It's an absolutely enormous number. But in fiscal year 2020, which ends in June for both countries, we expect remittance earnings to fall by more than 10%. Given that the pandemic has really only affected economies in the last quarter, that's a stark number. We also know that Pacific Islands are very dependent on the rest of the world in the sense that they import a number of their essentials, including food and health-related goods. And so supply chain blockages, the risk of food security nationalism, these things could impact food security and they could slow the procurement of health equipment. All of this also means, and this is something that we think is similar in the Pacific as we see elsewhere, is government budgets, both in terms of revenues and in terms of fiscal spend, are under tremendous stress. Tourism-dependent countries are seeing a fall in taxes and duties linked to tourism and imports. Domestic revenue between 2019 and 2020 is expected to fall by more than a quarter in Palau and Samoa and by 20% in Fiji. Commodity exports obviously are affected by the decline in export duties due to lower commodity prices and declining export demand. In PNG, for example, domestic revenues are expected to decline by more than 7% between 2019 and 2020. And with the increased spending that is being required on COVID-19 prevention and containment, as well as in order to shield economies from the aftereffects of the disease through stimulus measures, we're seeing fiscal deficits widen. Vanuatu, for example, is facing a deficit of 10% this year. These growing deficits, of course, will result, because in many cases they'll be financed by external borrowing, they will result in an increase in government debt. And while it's certainly the case that governments need to be as responsive as they can in the face of this very pressing crisis, this does create long-term issues that we must also keep an eye on. These issues, as I said, sort of spread throughout the economies. We did a recent conference call here at the ADB with CEOs of Pacific power utilities. And these companies, I learned on the call, and we know otherwise, they face a number of challenges as quarantine measures lower commercial activity by compressing revenue streams. and that this may further affect them as they have to suspend billing arrangements. Utilities, in addition, to a certain extent, will need to reinvest in CapEx, but in many cases don't have funding available at times of crisis to increase capital expenditure. And so these are issues, and that's just one sector. Another sector that will be deeply affected is the airlines. We're entering a time when the world will simply have too many aircraft, and we have a number of national airlines across the region, and their financial solvency, I think, is also an important issue that will have to be thought about. So how are governments responding? So taking first sort of the immediate actions to respond to the crisis. All Pacific governments have announced expenditures to strengthen the health sector for COVID-19 outbreaks. Excuse me. Governments are establishing quarantine and isolation units. They're purchasing medical equipment and consumables. They're increasing surveillance measures. Several governments have taken steps to also announce fiscal stimulus in order to replace the significant contraction in demand and to shield their domestic industry and population from the impact. So we've seen significant fiscal stimulus measures announced in a number of places: Cook Islands, Fiji, Palau, PNG, Samoa, Solomon Islands, Tonga, Vanuatu. And these range from 3.7% of GDP in the Solomons to more than 10% in the Cooks. Many of these packages, from our perspective, have been reasonably well designed, and we need to commend governments for moving both quickly and moving wisely. These packages seek to protect people, particularly vulnerable groups and unemployed, protect jobs, and to protect businesses that have been affected by the pandemic. Measures to support businesses have included tax reductions and utility tariff subsidies, special credit facilities, and loan repayment holidays. Countries have also increased unemployment benefits, and reemployment and training programs have been introduced in places like Palau, Samoa, and the Solomon Islands. There's also been a significant increase, not just in the Pacific, certainly we see it across Asia, and I know it's happening around the world, in cash transfers. In certain countries which have national provident funds, there's been an increase in dividends and payouts. Reductions in utility tariffs have been announced in a number of places. In some places, the hard work of trying to think about what does the future economy look like and how do we start to use the crisis to prepare for a different economic structure is also starting to get underway. Fiji and Samoa, for example, have taken important steps towards strengthening domestic agriculture, both as a way to build security, food security, but also as a way to provide employment for workers who've been laid off. In 6 Pacific countries that have their own currencies, monetary policy measures have also been taken to maintain an accommodative stance and to guard against declining macroprudential banking indicators, such as rising NPLs due to loan defaults. Central banks in Fiji, PNG, and Vanuatu have reduced policy rates or reserve requirements. In Samoa, the central bank is providing guidelines on prudent loan restructuring, so trying to help transition the banking system in that way. Unfortunately, however, resources are limited and government capacity is limited. And despite stimulus measures, most Pacific countries still have a limited ability to support the poorest and the most vulnerable, as these segments of society lack comprehensive social protection systems. Countries don't necessarily have unemployment insurance schemes in place to support those who lose their jobs. And of course, as in many other places in the world, there's a large group of people who work outside the formal sector. They lack social safety net programs, although Fiji is somewhat of an exception to this. And therefore, in many countries, there's an effort to simply provide universal support to the population under the assumption, the correct assumption, I think, in this context, that the critical need is to reach all of those in need. But of course, this does result in higher fiscal costs due to a lack of targeting, and that will give rise to issues in the medium to long term. Already Pacific governments are looking at their fiscal 2021 budgets. Some are planning second rounds of stimulus, but sustaining such support comes at a very, very high cost. Now, perhaps, after sort of laying out the health consequences, the economic impact and linkages to the rest of the world, and what the governments are doing to respond, perhaps I can now share a bit about how the ADB has been engaged to support. ADB is helping countries in a number of ways. So the first phase of this response was simply the reality that many places did not have the resources they needed to respond medically. And so we've been working with UNICEF in all countries across the Pacific to procure and provide COVID-19 medical consumables and supplies, with country allocations raising from as little as $99,000 from Niue to more than $1.5 million for Fiji and the Solomon Islands. But of course, countries also need support in terms of financing expenditure, and timely access to finance at a time when countries are facing significant contractions in domestic revenue base is particularly important. And 5 Pacific countries, RMI, FSM, Nauru, Tonga, and Tuvalu, have so far availed themselves of quick dispersing grants from the Asia Pacific Disaster Resilience Fund, APDRF, which is managed by the ADB. And this has provided grants of between $300,000 and $500,000 for immediate crisis-related expenses. Funds of about $2.5 million are being processed for the remaining countries. We also have a facility called the Contingent Disaster Financing Facility, which provides budget support in the event of a disaster. This was a facility that was actually designed primarily for climate-related disasters, but we broadened its definition to include pandemic-related emergencies. And so several countries, RMI, FSM, Tonga, Palau, Solomon Islands, and Samoa, have taken advantage of this, drawing amounts ranging from $2.9 million to $15 million. We're also supporting governments as they put in place larger stimulus packages. In Fiji, PNG, and Tonga, we're topping up our existing policy-based budget support operations that were already under preparation. We have a new COVID-19 related tool that was approved by our board on April 13th, which is providing up to $20 million in grants to places like Solomon, Palau, Vanuatu, and Samoa. And we're expecting to provide similar support later this year to Cook, FSM, and Nauru. We've also played an important role in coordinating with other development partners to provide assistance, because as we all know, in the Pacific as elsewhere, coordination amongst various partners is absolutely critical. And we're also advising governments through technical assistance on the design of stimulus packages, with a particular focus on ensuring that we have as well designed social protection aspects in these packages as is possible. Now, another area that we've started to think through and started to work with countries is, how do you bounce back better? I think we have to acknowledge at the outset how little we know about what the world will look like after this crisis. And so we need to approach this project of how do you bounce back better with some degree of modesty. But we do know that economic recovery in the Pacific will certainly in part, and probably significant part, depend on reestablishing economic links with the rest of the world. That outlook remains uncertain. But as with all places, the countries of the Pacific will face a trade-off between opening their borders and containing the spread of the disease. And Pacific policymakers, will have to consider whether they need to, retain containment measures for an extended period of time, particularly given the limited capacity of the local healthcare system and the extreme vulnerability, the remoteness, the lack, limits in terms of hospital beds, limits in terms of the ratio of hospital beds to the number of potentially infected people. The Pacific will have to take a cautious path on this balance between reopening for economic benefit and remaining restricted for the sake of preserving people's health. And even if travel restrictions are gradually lifted, the reality is that certain segments, such as tourism, simply will not see a quick and rapid recovery. I've seen this in other parts of the world that I've been involved with. Sometimes when you have a significant impact on tourism, I saw this, for example, when I was involved in the Middle East. Lebanon had a very devastating war in 2006. Tourism was 10% of the economy. Some people thought tourism would never come back. That crisis was so devastating. The reality is it took 3, 4, 5 years. It did come back. So tourism, I expect, will return to the Pacific, but it's going to take some time. And managing the losses and risk of business closure in the interim is going to be a difficult process, and one that's going to require a very intelligent set of policy design. One thing that has been interesting has been this idea of a corridor within which people can travel, and we'll see how that develops. but that could be an interesting option to retain some level of ongoing tourism. These sort of travel bubbles, as they've been referred to. I think the role of technology in this is also going to be quite important. When we look at trade, trade also provides a critical link for several Pacific countries, and as trade disruptions decrease, perhaps commodity exports can recover in line with global demand. That should also enable critical imports such as food products and construction materials for infrastructure projects to flow more freely. And perhaps when travel restrictions are lifted, and if at some point the global economy and certainly other large regional economies like Australia and New Zealand, as they start to come back to normal, hopefully we'll start to see this flow through the remittance channel and have a positive impact on countries. One thing that's very clear is that the COVID-19 outbreak has been an enormous wake-up call. And it suggests some key areas in which governments and their development partners really need to focus on in the medium term to build resiliency and to prepare for further shocks. The first of these is on building macroeconomic resilience. Governments have clearly acted quickly, but budget deficits are expected to rise as spending goes up and lower revenues are coming in. Governments are going to need to adopt strategies to help improve fiscal sustainability and debt management. As the recovery commences, certainly those who went into the crisis in a stronger position have had more tools at their disposal to deal with it. And this lesson needs to be internalized so that as we move forward, there's a greater focus on building buffers to respond to disasters, which, as we know, are a persistent risk across the Pacific. There will, of course, be trade-offs between the desire to build buffers and immediate development needs. And so those will really need to be assessed as we proceed on a case-by-case basis. I think concessional and grants and concessional lending, the sort of assistance that the ADB provides and other development partners provide, are going to play an even more important and pivotal role in ensuring governments have fiscal space while maintaining buffers. A second challenge is, the nature of the social contract is going to be rewritten in the world of the future. I think it's very clear that there'll be more demand from populations for greater support for health and greater social protections against job losses and economic impact. And this will present a challenge for governments. How does one define that new social contract and how does one build it? One of the things that we're doing is we're working with a number of places in the Pacific to build better delivery platforms because there's some real data limitations here. And we're going to need to think about, some basic entry points and some basic issues, including, do we need social safety nets to address chronic poverty? Or are they needed to respond to shocks, or both, or what combination of those? We need to think about what kind of targeting is most feasible and desirable. Is it geographic? Is it sectoral? Is it universal? In countries that have provident funds, Fiji, Samoa, PNG, and Tonga all have provident funds, is there a better way to use these funds so that we can provide support? How do we reach informal workers in the informal sector? How do we make use of community-driven platforms and informal networks to deliver social protection? These are all really important issues that we've been aware of for some time, but they're far more pressing and immediate than they were before this crisis. And then, of course, a critical element of this new social contract globally is going to be the need to strengthen the health sector. Now, this is a challenge everywhere, but in the Pacific, there are unique logistical and financial challenges in designing and delivering healthcare, and particularly in delivering it where and when needed by populations. Some of the things that ADB is recommending that countries focus on are training and technical guidance to health workers, on critical preparedness, readiness, and response actions, on procuring critical lab and medical equipment, including PPE equipment, and on engaging with communities on how to protect themselves and others, especially the vulnerable and those at high risk. Another issue that the COVID pandemic has drawn attention to is the state of the environment. I think this crisis, one of the things that it is highlighted to us is that the unimaginable or the theoretical can become real very quickly and at enormous cost. And I think that should serve as a wake-up call to all of us to continue to focus on the environment. Pacific countries really do need to continue, for example, to intensify efforts to improve the health of the oceans. This is both a source of economic value for countries because it will allow them to drive greater revenue from sustainable tourism as the economy recovers, but it's also a important end in and of itself. And better environmental management of the oceans will bring a number of benefits. It'll also help fisheries, which as we know are important sources of revenues for smaller islands and atolls. Here at the ADB, we're doing quite a bit on healthy oceans, and we're focused on blue economy, including inclusive livelihood and business opportunities. We're focused on supporting ecosystem management, protecting and restoring coastal and marine ecosystems. We're focused on pollution control. We've been focused on sustainable infrastructure. And so there's quite a bit that we're doing in this space, both ourselves and with our development partners. You know, so to close, I thought maybe I'll leave you before we turn to Q&A with a few thoughts. You know, as I said at the outset, the Pacific has done a wonderful job of protecting its people from this disease. But unfortunately, it simply cannot be isolated from the economic consequence. And so it confronts a world within which the risk of disease still looms large, although countries should be commended, Pacific countries should be commended for the job they've done now. That risk looms large, and that risk is enormous. You know, the number in PNG, you know, hospital bed capacity needs to go up 900x to manage a spike is just unbelievably stark. And as they confront the health issues, which they've done successfully, they simply can't avoid, you know, the economic tidal wave that's washing over their shores. And so countries are going to need to rely even more on each other and on regional partnership. I think partnership with institutions like the ADB is going to be more and more important going forward. We've been working with the Pacific for over 50 years. And while this is perhaps the biggest challenge we've confronted in this time, it's something that is going to continue to require very, very strong collaboration. And an important element of that collaboration will be idea sharing, will be the socialization of concepts and feedback. And places like the East-West Center play a very, very important role in ensuring that that ecosystem of ideas is very healthy and very dynamic and interactive. And so I'll pause there. I think we're going to take some Q&A. I'll turn it back to Satu, but thank you all again for taking time to be with us and for joining us in this presentation. It's been a privilege to present the ADB's perspective, as well as to share some of our priorities and some of the areas that we've been engaged in on this very important set of issues. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Mr. Saeed. That was a splendid assessment of the conditions post-COVID in the Pacific Islands, though I must say rather sobering as well, as it is elsewhere in the world. We're beginning to get questions on the Q&A and on the chat function, so I will give folks some moments to input their comments or questions. And in the meantime, let me ask you a couple of things that struck me in your presentation. One is rather general and a couple of more specific things. Let me start with the specific. One is you didn't mention much about the education sector. And I wondered what kinds of impacts are being had on closing schools, impacts on, you know, there are not a lot of universities, but the University of South Pacific in Suva, implications for distance learning in some ways might be better, which leads to my second question. What is the impact, if any, on digital connectivity in the Pacific Islands? Is that something they can rely on more in the circumstances? On the broader question, given where the Pacific Islands are, they're sort of comparatively big neighbors in terms of economy and connections are Australia and New Zealand. I guess I'm looking for sort of a hopeful sign. In some ways, Australia and New Zealand's conditions are relatively better than many other places in terms of their own responses to COVID and their upsurge on their economies. Could that be a way of softening the transition time for the Pacific Islands to get back on their feet? And are they open to these bubbles that have been proposed? Because as I understand it, some Pacific Island countries are still maintaining strong border controls, even though the region is met as a grouping to look for ways to adapt protocols for allowing PPE trade assistance to flow in. How much receptivity is there in participating in these bubbles, and from both sides, from the Australia, New Zealand side, as well as the Pacific Island side? So let me begin there and to get us going on the conversation, and I'll turn shortly to the Q&A as well.
Okay, thank you. There's a number of, I think, very interesting issues you raised there. Maybe I'll start with the travel bubble, and then also cover connectivity and education. So as you mentioned, the prime ministers of Australia and New Zealand, as we know, formally agreed to this trans-Tasman travel bubble on the 5th of May. And, several countries in the region have expressed an interest in joining that travel bubble. So I think the Cook Islands and Niue, which obviously has a very close relationship to New Zealand, have expressed interest in a travel bubble. I believe Fiji may also have. I think this could be a very, very important lifeline for the countries of the Pacific. And one of the real challenges of this crisis is that as you go into this social isolation in certain countries, travel isolation in others, there's just this tremendous destruction of productive capacity that occurs. And early in the crisis, I think there was this view that if there's enough fiscal stimulus and you can keep companies basically solvent and alive, the crisis will pass and we'll have protected the productive capacity of the economy so that we can continue forward from where we sort of had left off. Mm-hmm. It's now become clear that this isn't going to pass quickly. And so that more broadly, not just in the Pacific and elsewhere, is forcing, I think, in many places, and we're just at the early stages of this type of thinking, but it's forcing policy officials to sort of say, we can't just, resources will be limited. We can't support everybody. We really need to start directing support at a corporate level to the companies and the industries that we think will be viable in the aftermath, in the new world that emerges. By the way, that's not to say that they shouldn't be supporting the people affected. I mean, that's a separate issue. The people should be supported regardless of what industry they're in. It's clear that tourism is going to be a long-term viable industry for the Pacific. And so it's absolutely critical that there be enough revenue in this industry or enough government support to ensure that we don't really see the destruction of capabilities from a tourism perspective. And I think that's an area where the idea of this trans-Pacific bubble, could actually be helpful, or trans-Tasman bubble as it's known. Because if we can get some degree of de minimis traveling within this region where people have confidence in their health, at least that keeps certain industries viable, or at least more viable than they would otherwise be. And so I think that's one element of it. The other, of course, is remittances, because if people are trapped in Tonga or Samoa, unable to return to their jobs in New Zealand or in Australia, that obviously has an impact on remittance flows. So that's maybe perhaps a comment on the question of the travel bubble. It's not going to be easy to sort of engineer this, but to the extent it can be successful, I think it'll be important. There are some very important issues to be thought about around health risk to the islands because they're so small. You get a single COVID-19 positive case in, and it can really have a devastating impact. Whereas in a larger population like Australia, you can kind of contain it without affecting the entire country. And I think for that reason, some places like Samoa have been cautious about the bubble. But it's certainly something that I think could potentially, if well designed and done carefully, be supportive of certain places. But the priority, I think, does need to remain on health security in the first instance. Now, on the question of data connectivity, this is something that the ADB has been involved with. We just completed a very, very successful submarine fiber optic link to Palau, and so significantly increased the high-speed data connectivity of that country. It's very clear. I'm sitting in the United States and I'm working in Manila. You're sitting in the DC area. Your headquarters is in Honolulu, and yet I think that this crisis has, for all of us, highlighted the value from a productivity perspective and actually from a resilience perspective of high-speed data connectivity.
Mm-hmm.
And that infrastructure is not yet fully laid out and available, certainly not at the last mile across the Pacific. And I think this is an important nexus point to your comment about education. You know, I have a friend who describes, he formulates this in an interesting way. He says he believes every human being has a right to a minimum amount of data. And what he means by that, which is I think a very powerful formulation of the issue, what he means by that is that every human being on Earth who doesn't have access to high-speed data is bereft of many, many opportunities that flow as a result.
Sure.
You know, education in the first instance, right? But also telemedicine and healthcare,
Right.
telework. All of these things are dependent entirely on one's ability to be able to, you know, we're speaking across, if you added up all the miles involved in this conference call, it's, you know, maybe it's 100,000 miles, right, of internet connectivity. So it's an enormous statistic that makes productivity so much more possible. And so I think this is going to be an important area of focus going forward. How do you ensure that not just infrastructure generally, but digital infrastructure is in place, number one? And then how do you make sure that we have tools fit for purpose for that digital infrastructure? So just to close again on education, which you asked about, you know, we saw a few years ago, we saw this enormous surge in what they were calling MOOCs, massive online courses.
Mm-hmm.
And that industry has been interesting to watch because over the last several years, it initially started, there was this tremendous, you know, optimism, and then it didn't scale. But what we've seen now is that 4 or 5, 6 years later, it is starting to scale, but it's starting to scale because people have adapted old educational models for the new environment. It's a different set of skills. Being a successful online teacher is a different set of skills than being a successful classroom teacher. We're living through this personally with our kids, because that transition, you know, online learning wasn't the smoothest. But I think when we come back in the fall, if we're still online, the tools will be better. And so we need to go on this journey in terms of education. We're in the early stages. And so there's certainly been an impact in the Pacific as well as schools have been closed.
Thank you very much. Let me now turn, Mr. Saeed, to the questions in our Q&A queue, as it were. We have one now, and please forgive me for the pronunciation of the names. I will do my best. Mike Monteleone, with constrained macroeconomic conditions, what is your outlook on sustainable infrastructure over the next few years? Do you think countries will refrain from investing in large projects, or will they be viewed as potential economic stimulus activities, putting people back to work, etc.? And I wondered in that context, if I could just add whether you see any increase in, for example, Chinese-funded infrastructure projects or other country infrastructure projects in the region, even in this context.
So the current crisis has been a real problem for infrastructure because travel restrictions, the ability to do feasibility work, the ability of contractors to get people out. In certain cases, you even have contractors declaring force majeure, calling force majeure clauses on their contracts. So it's been an enormous disruption in terms of infrastructure build. Having said that, we will need smart forms of Keynesian stimulus going forward. We will need countries to do things that both have a significant positive multiplier that create jobs, that increase long-run economic potential, but also ideally that have positive externalities. And there are few things that are more positive from that perspective than sustainable infrastructure. We did a call at the ADB, as I mentioned during my talk recently, with the CEOs of utilities from across most of the Pacific Islands. One of the things that was very interesting for me to hear was that there was no interruption in the interest in renewable energy, for example. And in fact, there was a view that renewable energy had proven itself to be more sustainable because you're not relying on ongoing fuel imports. There was also a view that declines in oil prices hadn't necessarily resulted in any positive benefit to the utility because they were passing these through. So I think that I'm cautiously optimistic that this crisis will result in an increased focus on infrastructure generally, but specifically on sustainable infrastructure. I also think that people have realized that the unimaginable happens. And that also, hopefully, not just in the Pacific, but elsewhere, is going to make people more focused on the need for infrastructure build to be sustainable, green, and in the long run, healthy for us and healthy for the planet.
Thank you very much. We now turn to Danielle Lewis, whose question is, will the broadening of the emergency funds definition to include this pandemic shift the focus away from climate issues or funding for climate crisis resilience and response?
Well, it certainly won't reduce the importance of the issue. But at the end of the day, I think that's a great question because, you know, a dollar spent in one place is a dollar not spent in another. And so I think we need to be vigilant. Just in the middle of this crisis, we saw Cyclone Harold sweep through the region. And we can't assume that you know, the increasing pace of climate disaster will simply go away. So one thing that will be critical is we're going to need to replenish these funds. We're going to need to make sure we are also ready for a natural disaster and climate risk. We simply can't afford to do one or the other. So I think it's a great question. I think it points, you know, directly at a real risk. Now, I think we had to triage. We had to deal the patient on the table, and the patient on the table was and is COVID-19. But there is another risk looming, and we're going to need to replenish the coffers and to make sure we're ready for that one as well.
Thank you indeed. We turn now to Manu Chowdhury, who we've already spoken about the tourism part of the question and the coping from the virus. You spoke about the relatively minimal impact of the health crisis in the Pacific. But one specific question that Mr. Chowdhury or Ms. Chowdhury asks is, what was the WHO role in the Pacific Islands? I know that's really another organization, but if you have anything, because I'm sure the ADB works with a number of international organizations, do you have anything to say about the role of the WHO in the Pacific Islands?
Well, you know, as I think the question may indicate, you know, development work and certainly disaster response work or pandemic response work takes an ecosystem of actors. The ADB is only one. The single most important actor in that ecosystem, of course, is the government itself. But other partners, whether it's other countries, regional countries, out of regional countries, and international organizations, the World Bank, the ADB, in certain cases, the IMF on the economic side, the WHO on the health side, the UN system, UNICEF. All of these actors are very, very important partners to the ADB, but more importantly, they're important partners to the countries. And we make real efforts to make sure that we communicate regularly, that we're coordinated. And ultimately, you know, the WHO is the repository of specific health-related insight and knowledge. And so in this crisis has been, you know, tremendously important across the Pacific.